I didn't come here for stories. I came for gold. That's what I kept telling myself the whole way north, rattling in the back of the company truck while the mountains rose around us like frozen teeth. By the time we reached the Klondike site, night was already pressing in. The air smelled of diesel, wet wood, and something sharp underneath, like struck iron. The camp looked older than I expected. Rust clung to the corrugated siding. Mud froze in layers along the boardwalk. A single floodlight hummed overhead, throwing long shadows across a cluster of cabins. Beyond them was nothing but tree line, and the black throat of the mountain. The cold hit harder here, not just in the skin, in the bones. Inside the weigh station, the first thing they made me do was scoop a pan of pay dirt into the scale. The brass tray trembled as the grains settled, as if the machine itself had nerves. I leaned closer, watching the dial twitch, and that's when I heard it. Faint but steady, a metallic knock carrying through the floor. 1, 2, 2, 2. It matched the shiver of the dial, almost like the ground itself had a pulse. "You'll get used to that," a voice said behind me. I turned. Harlan Briggs, the foreman. His coat was clean, his boots polished darker than the rest of us. But his eyes raw, bloodshot in the corners, like sleep hadn't been his for years. He carried a brass pocket watch, thumbed it open, shut, open, shut. As he spoke, never once looking at the time. He led me outside to a worked oak board nailed between two posts. In the beam of his lantern, words burned into the wood by a hot iron came into view. The surface was split, letters crooked, but still legible. Above them hung a seal stamped in dull lead. A two-headed crow. Camp rules. Klondike Mining Division. Rule 1. Do not leave camp or enter the old shaft after midnight. Rule 2. If you hear picks or crying from the mine, lock your door. Do not shine your lamp. Rule 3. Do not open your cabin door at night, no matter who knocks. Rule 4. Do not answer eureka or whistles from the ridge. Rule 5. Do not look directly into the old shaft or the gold that breathes. Rule 6. Do not bring gold into your cabin. All fines go to the scale house. Rule 7. Do not speak the names of the lost outside the shaft. Rule 8. Do not use explosives in restricted ground. I read them twice, waiting for the punchline. But Harlan's face didn't shift. His hand tapped the side of his pocket watch, steady as a heartbeat. "Break a rule, you're gone," he said flatly. "Not just from the company, from the Count." "The Count?" I asked. He didn't answer. Just snapped the watch shut and walked off into the dark. The rest of the night was mine to settle in. My cabin was bare pine. The air inside damp and heavy with resin. The cot creaked when I dropped my pack. Somewhere nearby, a generator coughed, then settled into a low rumble. I tried to sleep to its rhythm, but every time I closed my eyes, the other rhythm bled in, the hollow tink-tink-tink of metal on stone. At first I thought it was just someone working late. The sound carried right against my wall, each strike spaced too neatly to be random. My breath fogged in the air. I sat up, gripped the edge of the cot, waited for it to stop. It didn't. I remembered the second rule. If you hear picks or crying from the mine, lock your door. Do not shine your lamp. My door was already bolted. My lamp sat cold on the table. The smart thing was to stay put, but the knocks kept coming, almost close enough to shake the frame. Tink, tink, pause. Tink, tink. I pressed my palms to my ears, rocking slightly on the cot, but I could still feel the vibrations in the floorboards. My teeth buzzed with it. My chest wanted to sink to that rhythm, heart trying to fall into step. Then, after a stretch of silence long enough to make me think it was over, the whole cabin shuddered. A single blow, heavier than the rest, like something striking from underneath. My lantern rattled across the table. I didn't move the rest of the night. I didn't sleep either. When dawn finally scraped its pale light through the shutters, I unlatched the door and stepped out. Frost glazed the mud. The generator clanked back to life. For a moment, everything looked ordinary again. Then I saw the wall of my cabin, 4 handprints smeared across the planks. each one dripping with wet, golden mud. And all I could think was I hadn't touched the door once. Morning didn't wash the night away. I stood outside my cabin staring at the handprints longer than I should have. The mud was still wet, a gold-brown paste that caught the light like mercury. It had seeped into the grain of the wood too deep to scrape away. I touched one fingertip against it, cold, almost oily. The smell clung to my skin after, sharp as struck matches. The others didn't seem surprised. Men walked past on the boardwalk with their mugs of coffee, talking shift rotations, pretending not to see. No one asked about the prints. No one asked if I'd slept. By noon, I was assigned to sluice duty. The work was simple enough, shoveling pay dirt into the wooden box while water from the flume washed through, separating lighter silt from heavier gravel. My boots sank in the mud, water biting cold around my ankles. The sluice rattled as rocks tumbled down. A constant chatter of stone on wood. For a while I lost myself in the rhythm. Shovel, dump, wash. The sky was leaden, the trees black against the ridge. But beneath it all, like a second heartbeat, I heard it again. Clink, clink, pause, clink, clink. At first I thought it was just another sluice box nearby. Then I realized it wasn't in the water at all. It was inside the rock wall itself. The sound came from under the cliff face that bordered the camp. Measured, patient. Too precise to be run off. I set the shovel down. The hairs on my arm rose. The rhythm matched the one from the night before. The one that had shaken my cabin. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The man beside me, an older miner with a missing ear, stiffened at the same moment. His knuckles whitened on the shovel handle. But he kept working, faster now, head down. "Don't stop," he muttered without looking at me. The knocking grew clearer, as if moving closer to the surface. My chest tightened with each strike. The wall seemed to pulse faintly with the sound, grains of sand trickling from cracks. I reached for the lamp clipped to my belt. Habit. Instinct. My thumb brushed the switch. Then I remembered Rule 2. Camp Rules. Klondike Mining Division. 2. If you hear picks or crying from the mine, lock your door. Do not shine your lamp. My fingers froze on the cold brass. The knocking quickened. I swear I felt it in my ribs. The wall bulged inward, just a breath, and in that instant I thought I saw something shift behind the stone. Like light trapped in liquid, gold seeping and retreating in time with the rhythm. "Keep your eyes down," the old miner hissed. His voice cracked, as if he'd said the same words many times before. So I did. I forced myself back into the shovel and sluice, muscles jerking like a puppet's. I didn't look again until the sound faded, slow as it came, swallowed back into the mountain. When it was gone, no one spoke. We just kept working, every shovel stroke louder than it needed to be, pretending we hadn't heard. Later, back at the way station, I saw the brass scale twitch again. The dial trembled before settling, just as it had my first night. No one else flinched. Abigail, the clerk, scratched the numbers in her ledger with a face like stone. The ink bled slightly, spreading in the shape of a feather. I left with my cut of script burning cold in my pocket, worth less than the gold dust it represented. And still the knocking followed me, echoing in the bones of my skull. That night, the camp quieted early. Men smoked in silence, staring at their boots. The floodlight stuttered, buzzing like a dying hornet. I bolted my cabin door and sat on the cot with the lamp unlit. My ears rang in the hush. For a while, nothing. Then there it was again. Clink, clink, pause, clink, clink. This time it wasn't under my feet, it was inside the walls. The boards of my cabin flexed ever so slightly, as though the whole structure were breathing. I pressed both hands against the wood and felt it. A pulse. Slow, steady, in perfect rhythm with the knocking. That's when I realized the sound wasn't just in the mine, it was in everything. And maybe, given enough nights, it would be in me too. The third day, they paired me with Martha Kane, I'd seen her around camp before. Broad shoulders under a patched coat, hair gone iron gray. A cigarette always smoldering at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't like the other miners. They kept their eyes down, worked their shifts, swallowed whatever the camp fed them. Martha watched. Everything. The men, the walls, even the sky, as if all of it could turn against her. We hauled our gear toward the edge of the old shaft. No one called it that officially. On the maps it was listed as Shaft 7C. Decommissioned. But in camp, everyone knew you didn't go near it. The ground sloped down into a narrow gully. Broken timbers jutted like rotten teeth. The air smelled wrong. Damp stone, ammonia sharp, like something alive had been buried too long. "Stay clear of the mouth," Martha said. Her voice was rough, years of smoke and winter ground into it. She tapped ash off her cigarette. The ember flared in rhythm. 2 taps. Pause. 2 taps. Exactly like the knocks. I tried not to look, but the shaft drew my eyes anyway. The timbers creaked, though there was no wind. In the dark beyond, light flickered, not like fire, more like something breathing. Gold swelling and retreating in slow waves, a lung of ore. My chest tightened. The longer I stared, the harder it was to look away. My grip on the pick loosened. For a second, I thought I heard it calling. Not words, just the rhythm pressing behind my eyes. Martha's hand clamped my shoulder, stronger than I expected for her age. "Don't," she snapped. "Stare too long and you'll dig until your bones. Even then you won't stop." Her grip made me shudder back. I blinked. The glow still printed against my eyelids, like after staring at the sun. Even with my eyes shut, I saw it. Gold veins pulsing, shadows moving in time. "Jenny thought it was someone crying," Martha said after a drag. Smoke curled from her nose, bitter as burnt cloth. "First winter I was here." She opened her door. By morning, there wasn't enough left to bury. She said it flat. No tremor. As if she'd repeated the story too many times to feel it anymore. But her eyes didn't leave the shaft. I swallowed. "Why stay then?" She laughed without humor. "Where else? Gold's here, work's here, and some of us know how to last." She ground the cigarette out on the frozen timber, leaving a black scar. Lasting means following the rules. Every night, every time. Slip once, gone. The air thickened around us. The shaft gave a low groan, a sound of stone shifting deep underground. I thought of the ledger Abigail had shown me, names crossed out in bleeding ink. I thought of the handprints on my cabin wall. Martha lit another cigarette with fingers that didn't shake. "You'll learn, Mercer, or you won't." We worked the slope until dusk. Pick against gravel, sluice washing grit, the ordinary motions of mining. But under it all, the mountain's pulse never left. Every swing of my arm felt like falling into step with it. When the sun dipped, shadows stretched long across camp. Martha shouldered her gear and jerked her head toward the cabins. "Enough. You don't want to be out when it wakes." That night, I lay on my cot staring at the dark. The handprints were still there on my wall, but fainter now, drying into the grain. I thought that was worse somehow, that the mountain didn't need to press again, it had already left its mark. The knock came later than usual, slower, heavy, like a heart that had to work to keep beating. I pressed my hands over my ears. But the glow Martha warned me about was still there, throbbing behind my eyes every time I blinked. I didn't need to look into the shaft anymore. I was already carrying its afterimage with me. By the 4th night, the rules weren't just words on a board. They were breathing things, nailed into me with every knock and glow. Not everyone believed that. Royce Walker least of all. He was the kind of man the mountain seemed to bait. Tall, broad, drunk more often than sober. The others muttered about him, but followed his lead when he left. "You people jump at shadows," he'd say, clapping shoulders hard enough to hurt. "Gold's gold. A voice in the dark doesn't change the weight of it." That afternoon, we worked the sluices along the creek. The sun barely reached between the spruce trees, but the water gleamed sharp as glass, sluicing pay dirt over the riffles. The rhythm of shovels was steady, comforting in its way, until a voice cut through the clatter. Eureka! It came from the ridge above, echoing down the slope. Not one of ours. Thin, metallic, stretched too long to be natural. The sound crawled in my teeth. Every man froze. Every shovel stopped midair. We all knew Rule 4. Do not answer. Don't even think it. Royce grinned, teeth yellow in the gray light. Hear that? He said. The mountain's congratulating us. Another Eureka rang. Higher this time. Closer. Some of the younger men flinched. Royce cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted back. Eureka! His voice echoed off the cliffs. He raised his pick in a mock salute, like he'd just won a prize. Something shifted in the stone above. A crack let loose a drizzle of quartz dust, glittering down. One of the green hands fumbled with his lamp. He clicked it on before anyone could stop him. The beam stabbed across the slope. For an instant, it caught the glimmer of a vein running along the rock face. White quartz, laced with gold. That pulsed faintly, like a vein under skin. The man yelped and staggered back. When he wiped his eyes, his hand came away flecked with yellow. His eyelashes clung together in wet clumps, stuck with grit that shone like filings. Royce howled with laughter. See, the mountain pays out to the bold. He leaned close to the wall, eyes wide, breathing in the dust. His pupils were gone in the glare. When he blinked, golden slurry leaked from his lashes, running down his cheeks like tears. No one moved. We all just stared, breath held, waiting for the mountain to claim him, but it didn't. Not yet. When we broke for mess, Royce strutted through camp, dust still crusted on his face. He smeared it across his knuckles like war paint. He slapped me on the back, left a golden streak across my coat. You look scared, Mercer, he said. His eyes were bloodshot, but in the whites, tiny veins glittered metallic. Scared of a little fortune? I wiped the mark off and said nothing. Silence was safer than argument. That night, I couldn't keep from thinking of the wall. The way the quartz had swelled and shrunk as if breathing. The sound of that false Eureka had burrowed into my skull. Every time I shut my eyes, I saw the gold vein throbbing in the dark. And Royce's face split with laughter, streaked with tears that weren't water. Sometime past midnight, the knock came at my cabin again, only once. Slow. Heavy. I didn't move. But through the thin wall, I swore at Royce's voice, muffled and wrong. Eureka. I stayed awake until dawn. The camp slept heavy that night. I could tell by the way the generator hummed steady, a low vibration under the boards, and the way the wind pressed flat against the tin roofs without lifting a single flap of canvas. A silence like that didn't come often in Klondike. Usually there was always something, some miner coughing through dust lung, some drunk snoring in his bunk, or the distant shovel clatter from those who couldn't stop digging, even off shift. That night, nothing. Nothing but the red eye of the stove in my corner, breathing slow under its iron lid, and my own pulse keeping pace. Then came the knock. 3 taps. Measured, not frantic, just enough to draw every nerve toward the door. I froze, breath snagged in my throat. Rule 3 came back clear as the day Harlan had read it from that rotted board. Do not open the door when someone knocks at night. The sound came again, this time firmer. From the next cabin over, cabin 7. The walls here were thin. I could hear the scrape of boots on the other side, the shift of weight, the creak of someone's bed frame. Then a voice, calm, almost casual. Open up. I knew that voice. Harlan Briggs. The foreman didn't wander after dark. He barely left the office shack even in daylight. Another knock, this time closer, pressing through the wood as though my own wall was next. Eli, the voice called lower. Just a word. My hands hovered near the lamp switch. thumb brushing the metal notch. The cabin walls vibrated with each knock, not like knuckles, but like something thick, slapping wet meat. It didn't echo. It sank into the wood. Cabin 7's door hinges whispered. Someone was moving inside. I heard a bunk creak, then boots scrape, like the man inside was shuffling toward the sound. The generator sputtered and died. The hum stopped. The whole camp drowned in silence. The door next door cracked open. For a second, I swear the air thinned, like the night itself held its breath. Then came the tearing. Not boards snapping sharp, not nails screeching out. This was wet and fibrous, fibers ripping like cartilage, wood split open like ribs under a cleaver. A scream followed, pitched high and human, and cut short mid-breath. The smell hit next, sweet and acrid. Sap boiling with scorched lamp oil. My nostrils burned. My hand gripped the lamp, but I didn't flick it on. I pressed myself into the boards, feeling them flex, hearing the tier of fibers peel just feet away. Then silence again. I don't remember falling asleep, if I did at all, but morning came thin and gray. Frost silvered the ground. When I stepped out, cabin 7's door hung ragged. Boards peeled down in strips, claw marks gouged deep into the grain. Men clustered around it. Pale faces set in grim silence. Someone lifted the camp's brass camera, the kind we used to record ore tallies and accidents. The shutter clicked. When the plate developed, the door was whole, untouched. The frame showed nothing, just bare walls. No wreckage, no gouges, as though the cabin had never been broken. A crow startled from the spruce above, wings beating hard, its cry sharp. Then silence dropped again, too sudden. Too complete. By noon, rope was strung across cabin 7. Harlan stood stiff, jaw set. Accident, he said. Ground shifted, cabins condemned, get back to work. No one spoke against him, but their eyes told the truth. They'd heard the knocks too. They'd smelled the wood rip, the oil burn. That night, I sat on my bunk, staring at my own door until the grain blurred. Every groan of timber in the wind pressed like knuckles against my chest. My hand hovered near the handle more than once, just to prove I could resist. I told myself I wouldn't touch it. I promised. But if the knock came in my name, would I have the strength? The ledger smelled of iron more than ink. Abigail Frost hunched over it like a priest at confession. The lamp threw her shadow crooked across the weighing table. The shack was damp with coal smoke, a wet heat that itched the throat. Each sack of pay dirt passed through her hands. She tipped one onto the brass scale, and the pan trembled longer than it should, as though something unseen leaned on it too. I watched the needle quiver, uneasy. Abigail's fingers were stained dark. The ink soaked so deep it seemed part of her skin. She beckoned me closer. "You want to last here, Mercer? Learn what this book means." She flipped a page. The ledger breathed like an old lung. Names ran tight across the margins. Bennett, Cross, Jenny Wills. Some were crossed through in red that had spread like ore veins in quartz. Even old marks glistened as if never dry. "Dead?" I asked. "Missing. Which is worse?" Her hand didn't shake, though her voice scraped thin. "I don't decide when the line goes. The ledger does, I only write it." "You mean the company?" Her eyes snapped up, sharp as ice. "Don't be stupid. This isn't payroll. It's prophecy." The stove popped. Dust fell from the rafters. A bead of red shimmered across the page, though she hadn't touched her pen. I swallowed hard. Abigail caught my wrist, pressed the nib into my skin until it pricked. "You see how it happens." Before I could answer, the door opened. Harlan Briggs stepped in, snow dripping from his coat, expression stone. He dropped a pouch heavy with grit on the scale. 53 grams. Log it." Abigail hesitated, lips thin. She dragged the nib anyway. The line hissed, crimson sinking deep. I swear the paper whimpered. Harlan's eyes cut to me. His thumb worked his pocket watch, snapping it open, shut, open again. "Ledger keeps us accountable. To each other, to the mountain. Abigail's jaw clenched. You make me strike through the living. Names cross because they break rules, he said flatly. Ledger only records. The lamp flickered. For a heartbeat, the shack shimmered gold, veins glowing through the boards like skin over a pulse. The pen lifted on its own, scratched across fresh ink. Royce Walker. The nib tapped twice before bleeding, like knuckles on wood. The shack answered with silence so heavy it groaned. The letters bled bright, red as cut flesh. A droplet ran down the margin and fell with a hiss onto the floorboards. I froze. Royce was alive. I'd seen him outside an hour ago, bottle in hand, laughing too loud. His voice still rang in my ears, Eureka. Thrown at the mountain like a dare. He's alive, I whispered. Abigail's grip dug into my wrist, her voice frayed like wet paper. Not for long. Once the ink runs, the mountain follows. She leaned closer, whispering, furious and desperate. They make me slash men still breathing, Mercer. Because it keeps production clean. No panic, no questions. Harlan didn't blink. He snapped his watch shut. Shifts over, back to your bunk. I stumbled into the night, snow needling my face. A crow startled from the spruce above, wings beating once before silence closed in. The camp seemed to breathe around me. Cabins swelling faint with each pick strike below. Royce's laughter carried, raw and careless. But underneath, I heard the picks matching him, beat for beat. The ledger hadn't written his death, it had scheduled it. Outside, the rhythm slowed, then stopped. For a moment, the whole camp held its breath, waiting for the next strike. The ledger hadn't left me. I carried its weight in my chest as if ink had seeped straight into my lungs. That night, Martha pulled me onto patrol. Rule 5, she muttered, pulling her coat tight. Never look straight into the old drift. Keep your lamp down. Ears open, eyes shut. We trudged along the ridge where the cabins met the frozen spruce. The moon barely cleared the peaks. A dull coin pressed flat in the sky. Snow crunched underfoot, brittle as glass. Somewhere deeper, the mountain exhaled steam, carrying that same ammonia stink I'd smelled outside the ledger shack. We stopped by the flume where the water was half-iced over. The sluice box rattled, though no one touched it. Gravel shifted as if invisible hands washed pay dirt through. Martha didn't flinch. She just pulled another drag from her cigarette, ash falling in rhythm with the sluice's rattle. Then it came, the tap, tap, tap. Slow, certain. Not from any cabin this time, but rising through the permafrost beneath us. My ribs remembered it before my ears. Martha killed her lamp. Down. I crouched. The cold bit straight through my gloves, numbing fingers. The sound grew louder, joined by another. Then another. Picks working a seam no living shift had been assigned. Through the spruce, I saw them. Figures bent double in the drift mouth. Backs broken the wrong ways, still swinging. Pickaxe down. Pickaxe up. Quartz cracked, spilling dull sparks into the rocker box. Their motions were mechanical, tireless, breathless. One straightened, vertebrae jutted sharp under torn flannel. The head rolled on a slack neck, eyes white as polished bone. Between the teeth glimmered flakes of gold, chewed until gums bled black. I clamped my jaw to stop from making sound. My lamp trembled in my grip. The sluice hissed as water carried the crushed ore. A slurry leaked down the run. Thick, metallic, reeking like wet copper. For a second I swore it pulsed. Martha's hand gripped my shoulder. See why Rule 5 exists? Another figure stumbled from the drift, dragging a sack. His boots left prints glowing faintly, mud that gleamed gold before fading dark. He wore a helmet half crushed, and where the skull should have been was only a cavity brimming with dust. The picks kept perfect rhythm. Not human rhythm. Not tired, not frantic. Just steady, like the mountain's pulse. A crow shrieked from the trees, wings slapping. The figures froze mid-swing. Every blind face turned toward us. Martha shoved me flat into the snow. My chest seized from the cold, lungs burning. She whispered, voice like broken gravel, "Don't move, don't breathe." The blind heads tilted, listening. One let out a sound, half a groan, half the scrape of steel on stone. Then, as if satisfied, they bent again to their endless labor. Picks struck in unison. We crawled back, inch by inch. My cheek dragged across ice, burning raw. I kept my eyes on Martha's boots until the drift vanished behind a stand of spruce. Only when the picks faded did she let me up. "What are they?" I managed. "Workers who didn't follow rules," Martha said flatly. Her cigarette ember was the only warm thing in the dark. "The mountain doesn't waste what it's claimed. Men, women. If you fall in line wrong, you'll dig forever." I wanted to tell her I'd seen one chewing ore, as if the gold itself had grown hungry through him. I kept my mouth shut. We reached the cabins at dawn. The sky bruised violet. From behind one cabin I caught sight of fresh tracks. Muddy, golden at the edges, leading straight to the sluice. No shift had been assigned there all night. Martha brushed snow off her coat, voice ragged. "Tell yourself you'll last longer by obeying rules. Truth is, mountain don't care. It keeps what it wants." I couldn't shake the rhythm. Each heartbeat fell in time with those picks. Tap, tap, tap. Even when I jammed my fingers into my ears, the sound carried through bone. In my bunk, I stared at the ceiling until dawn's gray blurred it out. On the wall above me, a faint handprint shimmered. Mud, streaked with a dull gold. Not from outside, but pressed from within. The dead were still digging, and the mountain wanted more hands. Silas Boone kept the same photograph folded into his shirt pocket. Edges gone soft as cloth. The camp had taken bets he'd wear it to his grave. Nights by the stove, while others smoked or sharpened picks, he'd slip it out. A creased print of a girl, maybe 8, hair pinned back with a cheap barrette. He'd rub his thumb over the gloss until it smeared. The gold dust on his hands clung to her face like freckles. He told me once, low, ashamed, that she baked him honey bread every Sunday before the Klondike pulled him north. "Sweetest thing you ever smelled," he said, eyes glassing. Butter and sugar, still warm when I'd come off shift. The words hung heavy. Men in this place didn't trade memories often. That night the rules sat louder in me than usual. Rule 6 especially, no golden cabins, but Silas carried it all the same. In the creases of that photo, gold dust had seeped into the paper. Into her smile. The wind hit harder past midnight. Tin roofs shook like cymbals. I woke to a noise different from the storm. A tune, slow, uneven. A lullaby. At first it sounded down the row, maybe a woman's voice carried wrong by the wind. Then it thinned, sharper, like metal striking metal in rhythm with the hum. The kind of sing-song you hear when ore runs through a chute. My blood iced when I placed it, a girl's voice. I sat up. Across the snow, cabin 9 leaked pale smoke through its seams. Silas's place. The glow inside was not lamplight but white, almost silver, flickering. The lullaby cracked once like a nail on glass, then went soft again. Words muffled, but the tune carried, almost coaxing. My stomach turned. The same way Jenny's crying had sounded in Martha's story, but sweeter. I pulled on boots, crossed to 9. The door trembled like breath held too long. From inside came that smell, sweet, doughy like fresh bread. For a second it filled me with hunger, so sharp it hurt. But beneath it rose something acrid, the bite of ore burning in mercury. "Silas," I hissed. No answer, only humming and the scrape of chair legs. I shoved the door. It stuck, swollen with frost. Inside, smoke layered thick. Silas crouched near his bunk, arms out like a man begging. His photo lay open on the floorboards. The white glow poured from it. No lamp, no flame. Just paper shining, edges curling as if hot. The lullaby came not from his mouth but from the air itself. The walls seemed to sing, vibrating the tin stove, chiming the pans on the wall. "Come back to bed, Daddy," a voice whispered in the glow. Silas reached. His fingers shook inches from the paper. nails black with dust. I grabbed his shoulder. Don't. The smoke surged, sweet then sour. A shape shifted in it, a child's face forming then collapsing. Hair pinned with something metallic. The barrette caught the light like a blade. The cabin walls flexed, groaning. A knock rattled from beneath the floorboards. Slow and steady, as if something inside the ground wanted in. I dragged Silas hard. He screamed her name, once. Clear enough to shatter Rule 7. The photograph went white-hot, its edges disintegrated into flakes of ash laced with gold. The smoke lunged, clawing in sheets of white and gray. Board split, stove tipped, a handprint slammed from the inside onto the frosted window. 5 fingers long, but jointed wrong, like bent pigtines. We tore free. I half-hauled him across the snow. Behind us, cabin 9 heaved once, then split. Wood peeling like bark. The glow collapsed, leaving only black steam and the stink of scorched sugar. Silas wept into his hands, gold streaks in his tears. In the rubble, all that remained was a single hair barrette, pinned into the snow. Cheap tin, bent crooked, stained with mud that gleamed faintly gold before fading dark. The mountain didn't need cabins to knock anymore. It was in my skin. I woke with my hand already moving, fingers dragging across my forearm. In the moonlight leaking through the slats, I saw it. Lines traced in gold mud, wet, glimmering. A crude map, quartz veins in their forks. My handwriting, though I had been asleep. A whisper still clung to my ears, the tale of a voice. Follow here, I'll show you where it fattens. We'll split it, just you and me. I clamped my jaws shut. Speaking meant answering. Rule 4 was carved into my skull by then. Still, my lips tingled, as if the voice had already passed through them. When I scrubbed the map, the gold didn't flake. It seeped deeper, smearing into pores. My skin shimmered faintly, even in the dark. I yanked my blanket up, pressed it hard until the glow dulled, as if smothering a coal. Work the next day was worse. Every strike of shovel into sluice mud vibrated through my chest. My ribs thrummed like strings. When I bent for water, the reflection staring back wasn't mine. It blinked late, pupils trailing white gold. Martha saw me clutch my arms. She muttered low, "Don't let it bargain, Mercer. Once you deal, you're bought." Then she spat into the slurry, a dark fleck vanishing under the flow. Abigail was worse. She caught sight of the faint shimmer on my wrist when I signed off the way. Her eyes narrowed. She thumbed her ledger. "It won't wait long," she whispered. Not to me, but to the book. Behind her, Royce laughed at nothing. He hadn't even come to weigh. Just stood outside, eyes jaundiced, repeating Eureka under his breath like prayer. That night, the voice came clean, not muffled, not half-formed. It spoke inside my skull. "You're not like them. You work careful. You respect rules. I can reward that. Just dip a hand in. I'll feed you forever. No one will know." My chest squeezed tight. Pick rhythm under the floorboards matched my pulse. Tap, 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 tap. I bit my lip until iron filled my mouth. No. I meant to think, but the word cracked out. The shack answered. Boards flexed, a nail squealed free. One word. That's all it takes. I'll keep your hands digging even when you're too weak. You won't starve. You won't leave empty. The map bled again across my skin. Letters I didn't know, but somehow understood. A promise. Shared vein. Shared flesh. I slammed my arm against the wall until splinters bit. The script smeared but not gone. Instead, it throbbed, glowed like veins under thin skin. I forced myself out into the cold. The sky above was smothered, the moon a blind coin. The whole camp pulsed faint, every cabin window exhaling that same yellow breath. Not firelight, something slower. Thicker. Snow hissed where it landed on me, as though it struck hot metal. Steam curled from my coat. I pressed both hands into the drift until my fingers numbed, but still, the glow pulsed under nails. Martha found me crouched there. She didn't ask, just jammed a rag in my hand. "Keep it wrapped. Don't let the glow breathe." When I unwrapped next morning, the cloth was stiff, stained with golden sweat. It had eaten holes clean through. I don't know if the others saw. They never said. Harlan only glanced once, long enough for his watch to tick, then turned away. Abigail wrote something in red. Royce grinned wide and shouted Eureka at the empty hills. Me, I kept my hands in my pockets and my mouth shut. But the pick rhythm under the earth had changed. It didn't just echo. It matched. Beat for beat. My own heart. The camp was brittle that night. Every board in the cabins creaked, like teeth ground in a jaw. The ledger had already scrawled Royce's name in wet red. Though he still walked among us, he made sure we all saw him. Royce stumbled from cabin to cabin with a bottle in his hand, slamming it on windowsills, shouting Eureka as if the word itself was armor. His laugh was glass on stone. Pie. Shivering. Men who dared peered out through slits in curtains, then slammed shutters fast. Leafier. I stayed still at my cot, but through the cracks in the wall I saw his silhouette, staggering, coat open, gold dust streaked across his cheeks like war paint. He had smeared it there himself, dipped fingers into the pay dirt, marked his face, daring the mountain to answer. And it did. The first time he screamed Eureka into the mouth of the old shaft, the picks went silent. Not just underground. The entire camp stilled, sluice water stopped trickling, even the wind cut out. For a breathless stretch, there was nothing but Royce's voice, echoing down into the ribs of the mountain. Then, faint and inhuman, the echo returned. Dozens of voices layered on his, all shouting the word back. They weren't shouts of triumph, they were wails, veins breaking. Royce laughed, swayed like he'd won. Hear that, boys? They cheer me. No one stepped out. We knew better. He staggered closer to the shaft, bottle swinging. Bent low, his eyes glowed wrong, white veined with liquid gold, like he'd been drinking mercury instead of whiskey. He slammed a fist against the timbers, shouting again, Eureka! This time, the ground gave. I felt it under my cot though I was cabins away, the pulse like a vein under flesh, swelling. The old shaft exhaled a blast of air, so hot it steamed the frost off the camp. Men screamed inside their cabins, holding doors shut as dust sifted through cracks. Royce stood in the middle of it, arms wide, laughing. Gold slurry rose up through the mud around his boots, swallowing them. He didn't fight. He opened his mouth wide, and the stuff poured in, flooding his throat, glistening at the corners of his lips. When he fell, it wasn't backwards. He went straight down, like a vein swallowing its own blood. The slurry boiled where he sank, a churn of yellow light and black water. Then it stilled. Only his hat remained, bobbing once before sliding under. The camp stayed silent long after. No one came out, not Martha, not Harlan. But the silence didn't hold. From the shaft came knocking, not fists but picks, striking in rhythm, answering Royce's chant. And with it, a sound like muffled laughter, hundreds of throats choking on gold. I pressed my palms to my ears, but it was inside anyway. Behind my eyes, Royce grinned, lips leaking gold. He whispered the word again, low, private, like it belonged to me now, Eureka. I didn't answer. God help me, I didn't. But I felt the ledger in Abigail's shack burn hot through the walls, as though the page with Royce's name had just turned over to find the next. And somewhere deep, my own heart beat double time with the picks. The night Royce vanished, the whole camp came under siege. It began with a knock. Not one, not on one door, on all of them. Every cabin wall shuddered, like knuckles were testing the grain. The rhythm wasn't frantic. It was patient, measured, the same heartbeat I'd felt in my wrists since the voices first spoke. Men yelled from their bunks. Some cried names through the cracks, breaking Rule 7. The names came back wrong, twisted. Coated in that same metallic edge Royce had shouted with. My lamp shook on the table, flame twitching, as if to bow. The air smelled of resin and salt, pine pitch boiled down with iron. Each knock rattled the nails in the beams. Through the boards, yellow seams of light pulsed, like veins beneath skin. I heard Silas Boone praying in the cabin beside mine. His voice cracked with his daughter's name. A cry answered from the dark. Not her voice. Something stretched and humming like a saw cutting bone. Then came the blast. Someone, later I learned it was a crew of green hands, dragged dynamite into the old shaft. Maybe they thought they could bury the thing, collapse the vein. Maybe they thought they could scare it. The detonation split the night. Like thunder trapped in the ground, my cabin floor jumped. Crockery shattered. And for an instant, all knocking stopped. Silence. Then a breath. The mountain inhaled. Air fled the camp. My lungs collapsed with it. Snow and ash lifted in a whirl, dragged toward the shaft. Then the glow came. It didn't seep, it surged. A plume of molten yellow, not fire, not smoke, something thicker, like the breath of a furnace made flesh. It rolled up the gully, washing over cabins, slipping under doors, licking at boots where men tried to run. Where it touched, skin blackened, cracked, and from the cracks, gold leaked. Not ore, liquid. It glistened from mouths, from eyes. Some dropped, wreathing, their fists pounding the earth as picks once had. Some rose again, joints wrong, jaws grinding. The knocking resumed, louder now, not at doors from within. Boards bent inward, as if the camp itself had bodies pressing from under the floor. Handprints smoldered gold on the planks, pulsing like lanterns trapped under the wood. Men screamed, others prayed. A few obeyed instinct, not rules, and fled toward the tree line. Their shapes barely reached the spruce before the glow snagged them, snared like veins reaching out, dragging them down into the snow. Martha yanked me by the collar. "Hold ground," she spat, eyes slitting against the glare. Her cigarette ember looked weak against the rolling breath of the shaft. Harlan barked orders from the mess hall steps, his voice cut through the din. "Lanterns out. Stay inside the ring. Don't break line." His hand clenched white around that watch of his, though I doubt he saw the hour. I staggered with Martha toward the central fire pit. The last flare hissed crimson against the gold tide, making the ground ripple like living skin. In its light, the carved emblem on the supply crates showed clearer than ever. The two-headed crow, wings outstretched, beaks gnawing the same vein. Silas broke ranks. His eyes shone, tears of gold. "She's calling me," he sobbed, staggering toward the shaft. I lunged, grabbed his arm. It burned, his skin fever-hot, slick with molten grit. My palms smoked where I touched him. "Let me go," he pleaded, "just once more." Behind us, the glow rose higher, cresting the cabins like a tide. Shapes swam in it. Miners with no faces, mouths grinding gold, picks swinging in rhythm. Martha hissed in my ear, "Choose, Mercer, him or the line, you can't have both." I looked at Silas, eyes drowned in yellow, breath a furnace, and I thought of his photograph, the little girl's smile already freckled with gold dust. The ground thundered, the mountain exhaled, and all around us the knocking stopped, because the doors were gone. The camp itself was breathing. I made it out. That's what I keep telling myself, that the mountain came with me. Morning after the blast, the camp was quiet as snow. Quiet the way a grave is. No picks, no shouting, just frost thick as fur on the cabins. Silas was gone, Martha too. Half the beds stood empty, covers thrown back as if their owners had only stepped away. But no footprints in the snow, no drag marks, just absence. Harlan gathered the handful left by the way shack. His coat black with soot, watch chain bright against it. He spoke flat. Company policy. First month sorts the keepers from the gone. You've seen enough. Decide now. Stay and dig, or leave. No one answered. We didn't need to. His watch clicked open. Shut. Open, shut. Louder than words. He didn't wait for volunteers. He just turned back toward the shaft, ledger under his arm, as though half the camp hadn't been swallowed whole. Abigail shut the ledger with a snap that made me flinch. The red ink inside hadn't dried. Royce's name still bled, though there was no Royce to weigh in. I walked, past the cabins, down the frozen cut, through spruce weighted with hoarfrost. I didn't look back. If I did, I knew the whole camp would be watching, through windows rimmed in gold. The steamer south was late, but I waited 3 days until it came. The town at the river mouth smelled of fish rot and coal smoke. A stink that meant life, not death. Men bargained. Women carried water. Dogs howled. Normal noises. I thought I was safe. By the time we hit Juneau, I'd convinced myself. I was just a laborer who'd quit a bad claim. The things I'd seen were fever. Dream. I took a room over a saloon. The walls bled heat from the stove below, the mattress sagged, and I thought finally I'd sleep through a night without knocking. But the first dark, the lamps clicked off. Not all at once. No storm, no outage. They dimmed in sequence, block by block, in rhythm, like a pick striking down through stone. My window frosted white from the inside. On the glass something bloomed. 2 wings, black, facing each other. The company's seal, crow doubled. Det hoarfrost, stamped in hoarfrost. I scraped it with my nail, the ice flaked. But underneath, lines gleamed, not frost, not dirt, of yellow, oily, breathing. I tell myself I could still leave. Book passage farther south, Seattle, San Francisco, as far from Klondike as my legs and pockets carry me. But I know better. The handprints are already here. Last night on my wallpaper, pressed from within, small as a child's, but joints bent wrong. My breath fogged gold in the mirror. Not much, just a shimmer, but more each morning. I keep hearing Royce, faint as a whisper in marrow, Eureka. And under it, the steady knock, knock, knock. Not at the door this time, inside. The mountain doesn't stay in the Yukon. It doesn't need a claim to spread. It's in the vein, it's in me. And when I sleep, I dream in seams of gold. They breathe, they want out, closer than ever. The picks hammer on. And I know now, when I blink awake in this city, I'll see the camp still digging, still calling. Not behind me, not beneath me, but through me. I left the Klondike. The Klondike never left. The load doesn't stay in the mountain. It's inside me now.